morning air in London was crisp and cool as hundreds of people gathered outside Windsor Castle. It was one of those perfect September days that made everyone want to be a tourist. The sun was shining just right, casting beautiful shadows across the old stone walls that had stood for nearly 1,000 years. Among all these excited visitors was a woman named Patricia, who had traveled all the way from America. She was in her 50s, wore expensive clothes, and carried a designer handbag that probably cost more than most people made in a month. Patricia was used to getting her way in life. Back home, she lived in a big house, drove a luxury car, and belonged to the most exclusive country club in her town. Patricia wasn't alone on this trip. Her daughter Kelly was with her, looking a bit tired and stressed. Kelly had been trying to keep her mother happy during their week-long vacation in England, but it wasn't easy. Patricia had complained about everything so far. The hotel room wasn't fancy enough. The food was different from what she was used to. The weather was too cold. Even the way people talked annoyed her. But today was supposed to be special. They were going to see the famous changing of the guard ceremony at Windsor Castle. Patricia had seen it in movies and on TV shows her whole life. She had been looking forward to this moment and had already planned exactly how she wanted her photos to look. The crowd was getting bigger by the minute. People from all over the world had come to see this famous tradition. There were families with little kids, elderly couples taking photos, and young backpackers trying to get the best spots. Everyone was excited and talking in different languages. Patricia looked around at all these people and felt annoyed. She didn't like crowds. She especially didn't like waiting. Back home, she never had to wait for anything. When she went to restaurants, they always had her table ready. When she went shopping, store workers would help her right away. She was important, and people treated her that way. The famous Red Guards were already in position. They stood perfectly still like statues wearing their traditional uniforms. Their red jackets were bright and clean, and their tall black hats made them look even taller. These weren't just regular soldiers dressed up for tourists. These were real military men who had served their country in dangerous places around the world. One guard in particular caught Patricia's attention. He was young, probably in his 20s, and stood at attention near where she was standing. His name was Private Johnson, though Patricia didn't know that. What she did know was that he was standing exactly where she wanted to take her perfect photo. Patricia had brought her expensive camera and her phone. She had already posted several photos on social media during her trip, and each one had gotten lots of likes and comments from her friends back home. But she wanted something really special from today. She wanted a photo that would make everyone jealous. Kelly noticed her mother staring at the guard and felt nervous. She knew that look on her mother's face. It was the same look Patricia got when she was about to cause a scene at a restaurant or demand to speak to a manager at a store. The ceremony was about to begin, and the crowd was getting more excited. People were holding up their phones and cameras trying to get good angles. Children were asking their parents questions about the guards. Tour guides were explaining the history of the tradition to their groups. Patricia pushed forward through the crowd, not caring if she bumped into other people. She was determined to get to the front. Kelly followed behind her, apologizing to the people her mother had pushed past. When Patricia finally reached the front, she was standing just a few feet away from Private Johnson. She could see every detail of his uniform, from the shiny buttons on his jacket to the way his boots were polished to perfection. This was exactly what she needed for her photo. She raised her camera and took a few shots, but something was bothering her. The angle wasn't quite right. She wanted to get closer, but the guard was in her way. She looked at him standing there so still and straight, and an idea formed in her mind. Back home, when Patricia wanted something, she just asked for it. If she wanted a better table at a restaurant, she asked. If she wanted to return something without a receipt, she demanded it. And people usually gave her what she wanted because she was confident and persistent. Kelly watched her mother with growing worry. She could see that Patricia was planning something, and it probably wasn't going to end well. Kelly had been embarrassed by her mother's behavior several times during this trip already. Just yesterday, Patricia had made a scene at their hotel because she didn't like the view from their room. The crowd around them was getting quieter as the ceremony was about to start. This was a serious moment for many people. Some of the older British visitors had tears in their eyes as they watched. This tradition meant something important to them. It was part of their history and culture. But Patricia wasn't thinking about history or tradition. She was thinking about her photo and how amazing it was going to look on her social media. She imagined all the comments and likes she would get. Her friends would be so impressed that she had gotten such a close-up shot of a real British Guard. The morning sun was getting brighter, creating perfect lighting for photos. Other tourists were already taking pictures and seemed happy with what they were getting, but Patricia wasn't satisfied. She never was. She always wanted more, always wanted to be special, always wanted to stand out. Private Johnson continued to stand at attention, completely focused on his duty. He had been doing this job for 2 years and had seen all kinds of tourists. Most were respectful and just wanted to take photos from a distance. Some tried to talk to him, not understanding that he couldn't respond while on duty, but he had never experienced anything like what was about to happen. Kelly tried one more time to get her mother's attention. She gently touched Patricia's arm and whispered that maybe they should just take photos from where they were standing. The lighting was good and they could see everything perfectly, but Patricia had already made up her mind. She was going to get the perfect photo no matter what it took. She had paid a lot of money for this vacation, and she deserved to get exactly what she wanted. In her mind, these guards were just there for tourists anyway. They were like actors in a show and she was the customer. The crowd fell completely silent as the ceremony was about to begin. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Hundreds of cameras were ready, and the atmosphere was filled with excitement and respect. Patricia looked at the guard one more time and stepped forward. She had no idea that in the next few minutes, her entire life was about to change forever. As the ceremony began with the sound of marching boots on stone, Patricia made her move. She walked right up to Private Johnson, completely ignoring the invisible boundary that every other tourist seemed to understand and respect. The crowd behind her watched in surprise as she positioned herself directly in front of the young guard. Private Johnson could see her approaching from the corner of his eye, but he remained perfectly still. His training had prepared him for this kind of situation. Tourists sometimes got too close or tried to interact with the guards, but his job was to stay focused and maintain his position no matter what happened around him. Patricia looked up at the guard and smiled the same smile she used when she wanted something from store managers or restaurant servers back home. It was a smile that said she was important and expected to be treated that way. "Excuse me," she said in a loud voice that carried across the quiet crowd. "I need you to move just a little bit to your left. I'm trying to get the perfect photo here and you're blocking my shot." The guard didn't move or respond. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, looking over Patricia's head toward the castle walls. This was exactly what he was supposed to do. The Queen's guards were famous around the world for their ability to remain motionless and silent, no matter what distractions came their way. But Patricia wasn't used to being ignored. Back home, when she spoke to someone, they listened. When she made a request, people usually tried to help her. She waited a few seconds, expecting the guard to acknowledge her and move out of her way. When nothing happened, her smile faded and her voice got a little sharper. "Hello, did you hear me? I said I need you to move. I've come all the way from America to take this photo and you're ruining it." Kelly felt her stomach drop. She could see other tourists starting to stare at them. Some people were already pulling out their phones, but not to take photos of the ceremony anymore. They were pointing their cameras at Patricia and the guard. "Mom, please," Kelly whispered, trying to pull her mother away. "He can't talk to you. That's the whole point. They're not supposed to move or speak while they're on duty." But Patricia wasn't listening to her daughter. She was getting more frustrated by the second. In her mind, this was completely unreasonable. She was a paying tourist at a tourist attraction. The guards were there for people like her to see and photograph. Why was this young man being so rude and unhelpful? She stepped even closer to Private Johnson, now standing right in his personal space. If he had been a regular person on the street, this would have been completely inappropriate. But he was on duty, representing centuries of military tradition, and he couldn't break character no matter how uncomfortable the situation became. "Look, I don't know what your problem is," Patricia said, her voice getting louder and more demanding, "but I'm not asking for much here. Just step to the side for 2 seconds so I can take my photo. Is that really so hard?" The crowd was getting more uncomfortable by the minute. Some parents were covering their children's ears because Patricia's voice was getting quite loud. Other tourists were exchanging worried glances and starting to whisper among themselves. An elderly British man in the crowd shook his head sadly. He was a military veteran himself and understood exactly what the young guard was going through. "She has no idea what she's doing," he muttered to his wife. "Those boys are trained soldiers, not theme park employees." Patricia noticed that people were staring at her, but she misunderstood why. In her mind, they were probably thinking the same thing she was, that this guard was being unreasonable and rude. She felt justified in her demands and decided to try a different approach. "Do you know who I am?" she asked the guard, using a tone that had worked for her many times before. "My husband owns one of the largest investment firms in Connecticut. We donate thousands of dollars to charity every year. I'm not just some random tourist here." Private Johnson's jaw tightened slightly, but that was the only sign that he had heard her. Inside, he was doing exactly what his training had taught him to do. He was staying calm, remaining focused on his duty, and not letting outside distractions affect his performance. Kelly was mortified. She could see that more and more people were watching them now. Some were definitely recording with their phones. She knew her mother well enough to know that this wasn't going to end quietly. Patricia never backed down when she felt like she was being disrespected. "Mom, seriously, let's just go find another spot," Kelly pleaded. "There are other guards we can take photos with. This isn't worth making a scene over." But Patricia was beyond reasoning with at this point. She felt like her authority was being challenged, and that was something she simply couldn't tolerate. Back home, she was used to being the most important person in any room. Hotel managers knew her by name. Store owners gave her special discounts. Even her doctor would see her without an appointment if she called. Now here she was, being completely ignored by some young soldier who probably made less money in a year than she spent on handbags. It was insulting and embarrassing, especially with all these people watching. She decided to try being more direct. Patricia reached out and waved her hand right in front of Private Johnson's face, trying to get his attention. "Hello, Earth to Guard. I'm talking to you." This caused several people in the crowd to gasp audibly. Even tourists who didn't know much about British military traditions could sense that what Patricia was doing was crossing a line. The atmosphere around them was becoming tense and uncomfortable. A young couple from Australia who had been standing nearby decided to move to a different spot. "This is getting weird," the woman whispered to her boyfriend. "I don't think you're supposed to touch the guards or get that close to them." Patricia heard the whispers and assumed people were supporting her. She turned around to address the crowd, expecting to find allies who agreed that the guard was being unreasonable. "Can you believe this?" she said loudly to anyone who would listen. "I'm just trying to take one simple photo and this guy won't even acknowledge that I exist. Is this really the famous British hospitality I've heard so much about?" But instead of the support she expected, Patricia found herself looking at dozens of disapproving faces. People weren't nodding in agreement with her. They were staring at her like she was doing something wrong. Some were shaking their heads. Others were taking steps back as if they didn't want to be associated with what was happening. This confusion and disappointment only made Patricia more angry. She wasn't used to people disagreeing with her or making her feel like she was in the wrong. Usually when she complained about service somewhere, other customers would either agree with her or stay out of it entirely. She turned back to Private Johnson, who was still standing perfectly still despite everything that was happening around him. His composure and professionalism were actually making Patricia more frustrated. In her mind, his silence was a sign of disrespect rather than military discipline. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth. "If you want to play games, we can play games. I didn't come all this way to be treated like this by some kid in a costume." Kelly felt panic rising in her chest. She knew that tone in her mother's voice. It was the same tone Patricia used right before she did something dramatic and embarrassing. Kelly had seen it happen at restaurants when the service was slow, at stores when return policies weren't flexible enough, and at hotels when rooms weren't exactly what Patricia had expected. The crowd was now completely focused on the drama unfolding in front of them, rather than the ceremony that was supposed to be taking place. Camera phones were definitely recording, and some people were live streaming the incident on social media without Patricia realizing it. Private Johnson continued to do his job perfectly, but inside he was preparing himself for whatever might come next. His training had covered difficult situations with civilians. But he had never imagined anything quite like this would happen. During a routine ceremony at one of Britain's most famous tourist destinations, the morning that had started so perfectly was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted. Patricia's frustration had reached a boiling point. She stood there for a moment, staring at Private Johnson's perfectly composed face, feeling more insulted and angry than she had ever felt in her life. The fact that he continued to ignore her completely was driving her absolutely crazy. She looked around at all the other tourists who were now openly staring at the situation she had created. Some had their phones out, clearly recording what was happening. Others were whispering to each other and shaking their heads. A few parents had picked up their small children to get a better view of what was going on. In Patricia's mind, all of these people were witnessing her being publicly disrespected by this young guard. She felt humiliated and angry, and she needed to do something to regain control of the situation. Back home, when people didn't give her the respect she felt she deserved, she knew how to handle it. Kelly was still tugging on her mother's arm, trying desperately to pull her away from the guard. "Mom, please, let's just go. People are staring. This isn't worth it. We can take photos somewhere else." But Patricia shrugged off her daughter's hand and stepped even closer to Private Johnson. She was now standing so close that she could see the individual threads in his red uniform and smell the polish on his black boots. "I've had enough of this nonsense," she announced, loudly enough for everyone around to hear. "If you won't move voluntarily, then I'll just have to work around you." Without any warning, Patricia reached out and grabbed the barrel of Private Johnson's rifle. She tried to push it to the side, thinking that if she could just move his weapon out of the way, she could get the angle she wanted for her photo. The moment her hands touched the rifle, several things happened at once. Private Johnson's grip on his weapon tightened automatically, but he still didn't move or speak. Several people in the crowd gasped loudly and stepped backward. Kelly let out a small scream and covered her face with her hands. Touching a guard's rifle was something that was absolutely not allowed under any circumstances. Everyone who had done even basic research about visiting these ceremonies knew that the guards were real soldiers with real weapons, and interfering with them was both dangerous and illegal. But Patricia either didn't know this rule or didn't care about it. When the rifle didn't move the way she wanted it to, she became even more frustrated. She felt like Private Johnson was deliberately making things difficult for her, and she wasn't going to stand for it anymore. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, her voice echoing off the castle walls. "All I want is one simple photo. Why are you being so difficult about this?" A security guard who had been watching the ceremony from a distance started walking quickly toward the commotion. He could see that the situation was escalating beyond what a normal tourist interaction should be, and he was trained to intervene before things got completely out of hand, but he wasn't fast enough to prevent what happened next. Patricia let go of the rifle and took a step back, her face red with anger and embarrassment. She could feel hundreds of eyes watching her, and she could hear people talking and whispering about what she was doing. Some of the comments she could hear weren't very nice. "That woman has lost her mind," someone said in a British accent. "Why would anyone think it's okay to touch a guard's weapon?" asked another voice. "Someone should call security," suggested a third person. These comments made Patricia even angrier. In her mind, she was the victim here. She was the paying customer who was being treated poorly by someone who was supposed to be providing a service. The fact that other people were criticizing her instead of supporting her felt completely unfair. She turned to face the crowd, her designer handbag swinging from her shoulder as she moved. "Are you all just going to stand there and watch while this person treats me with such disrespect?" she demanded. "I paid good money to be here, and I deserve better treatment than this." But instead of getting the support she expected, Patricia found herself looking at a sea of disapproving and shocked faces. Some people were shaking their heads in disbelief. Others were recording her outburst with their phones. A few were already starting to walk away, not wanting to be part of whatever was happening. Private Johnson remained perfectly still through all of this. His training had prepared him for many difficult situations, but this was definitely one of the strangest things that had ever happened to him during a ceremony. He could feel the woman's anger and frustration, but he knew that his job was to stay focused and maintain his position, no matter what distractions came his way. Kelly was absolutely mortified. She had never been so embarrassed in her entire life. She could see people taking photos and videos of her mother's breakdown, and she knew that this was going to end up on the internet for everyone to see. She tried one more time to get her mother to leave. "Mom, please, everyone is watching. Let's just go back to the hotel. We can come back later when it's less crowded." But Patricia was beyond listening to reason at this point. She felt like her dignity and authority were being challenged in front of all these strangers, and she couldn't let that happen. She had never backed down from a confrontation in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. That's when she made the decision that would change everything. Patricia lifted her expensive designer handbag, the one that had cost her more than most people made in a month. It was heavy, filled with all the things she considered essential for a day of sightseeing. Her wallet, her passport, her expensive camera, her makeup, and various other items that added considerable weight to the bag. "How dare you ignore me?" she screamed at Private Johnson, her voice cracking with rage and frustration. And then, without any further warning, she swung the handbag as hard as she could and struck the young guard directly across his shoulder and upper arm. The sound of the impact was sharp and loud, audible even over the noise of the crowd. Private Johnson's body absorbed the blow, but he didn't flinch or step out of position. His training and discipline held firm even in this shocking moment. But the crowd's reaction was immediate and dramatic. The gasps and cries of shock that rose from the hundreds of witnesses were so loud that they echoed off the castle walls. Parents instinctively pulled their children closer. Other tourists stumbled backward in disbelief. "Oh my God!" Someone screamed. "She just hit him!" shouted another voice. "Did anyone else see that?" asked a third person, though it was clear that everyone had seen exactly what had happened. Kelly stood frozen in place, her mouth open in complete shock. She couldn't believe what her mother had just done. Even for Patricia, who had caused scenes before, this was going way too far. Patricia herself seemed surprised by what she had just done. For a moment, she just stood there holding her handbag, looking at Private Johnson's face for some kind of reaction. But the guard continued to stare straight ahead, showing no emotion or response to what had just happened to him. The security guard who had been approaching the situation broke into a run. This was no longer just a difficult tourist who needed to be redirected. This was now a criminal assault on a member of the British Armed Forces, and it needed to be dealt with immediately. Several other security personnel appeared from different directions, all converging on the spot where Patricia was standing. They had been watching the situation develop through security cameras, and had been preparing to intervene even before the physical assault occurred. The crowd around them continued to buzz with shocked conversations and the clicking sounds of phone cameras capturing every moment of what was quickly becoming an international incident. Patricia looked around at all the staring faces and realized that maybe, just maybe, she had made a terrible mistake. The moment Patricia's handbag made contact with Private Johnson's shoulder, the entire atmosphere around Windsor Castle changed completely. What had been a peaceful, respectful ceremony suddenly became something much more serious and disturbing. The crowd of tourists, which had been quietly enjoying the traditional ceremony just moments before, erupted into shocked gasps and horrified whispers. The sound rippled through the hundreds of people gathered there like a wave, starting with those closest to the incident and spreading outward as people realized what they had just witnessed. "Did she really just hit that guard?" asked a woman from Canada, her voice filled with disbelief. "I can't believe what I just saw," said a man from Germany, shaking his head as he continued recording with his phone. Children who had been excited to see the famous guards were now looking confused and scared. Many of them had never seen an adult behave so badly in public before. Parents quickly moved to comfort their kids and tried to explain what was happening without frightening them further. "Mommy, why did that lady hit the soldier?" asked a little girl in a sweet British accent. Her mother struggled to find an appropriate answer. "Some people don't know how to behave properly, sweetheart. That guard is a hero who protects our country, and what that woman did was very wrong." The phones and cameras that had originally been pointed at the ceremony were now all focused on Patricia. Dozens of tourists were recording the incident from different angles, capturing every detail of what was happening. Some were already uploading the videos to social media platforms, where they would soon be seen by millions of people around the world. Kelly stood frozen next to her mother, her face completely pale with shock and embarrassment. She could hear people around them talking about what Patricia had done, and none of the comments were supportive or understanding. Everyone seemed horrified by her mother's behavior. "I'm so sorry," Kelly whispered to anyone who would listen. "I'm really sorry." She's not usually like this. But even as she said it, Kelly knew it wasn't entirely true. Her mother had always been demanding and difficult. But this was definitely the worst thing she had ever done. A group of British tourists who had been standing nearby were particularly upset by what they had witnessed. To them, the Queen's Guard represented something sacred about their country's traditions and military heritage. Seeing someone assault one of these guards felt like a personal attack on everything they valued. "That's absolutely disgusting behavior," said an elderly man who had served in the British Army many years ago. "Those boys have served in war zones. They've risked their lives for their country, and this is how some entitled tourist treats them?" His wife nodded in agreement, her eyes filled with tears of frustration. That young man showed incredible restraint. "If someone had hit my son like that, I don't know what I would have done." Word of the incident was spreading quickly through the crowd, even reaching people who hadn't directly witnessed it. Those who had seen it were describing what happened to others, and the story was getting more dramatic with each retelling. "Some American woman just attacked one of the guards with her purse," someone was saying near the back of the crowd. "She tried to move his rifle and then hit him when he wouldn't respond to her," added another. "Boys, the whole thing was caught on video. It's going to be all over the internet in minutes." Patricia began to realize that the situation was not developing the way she had expected. She had thought that hitting the guard might finally get his attention and force him to acknowledge her presence. In her mind, it had been a last resort to deal with what she saw as incredibly rude behavior. But looking around at the crowd now, she could see that no one was supporting her actions. Instead of seeing the understanding and sympathy she had expected, she was seeing shock, disgust, and anger on every face she looked at. A businessman from London stepped forward from the crowd, his voice loud enough for everyone around to hear. "What you just did is completely unacceptable," he said directly to Patricia. "That guard is a serving member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. He has probably served in Afghanistan or Iraq, risking his life to protect people like you. And this is how you repay that service?" Other people in the crowd began voicing their own opinions, and none of them were favorable toward Patricia. "You should be ashamed of yourself," called out a woman with a Scottish accent. "That's assault." "What you just did," added a man who appeared to be familiar with legal matters. "Someone needs to call the police," suggested another voice from the crowd. Patricia felt surrounded by hostility and criticism. This was nothing like what happened back home when she complained about poor service or made demands that weren't met. Usually other customers either supported her or stayed out of the situation entirely. She had never experienced this kind of universal condemnation before. Private Johnson continued to stand perfectly at attention, showing no reaction to either the assault or the chaos happening around him. His discipline and professionalism in the face of such an unprecedented situation was actually making the crowd even more supportive of him and more critical of Patricia. "Look at him," said a young woman who was visiting from Ireland. "He's not even acknowledging what happened. That's the mark of a true professional." Meanwhile, this tourist is having a complete meltdown because she couldn't get her perfect photo. The security guards who had been approaching the scene were now close enough to take action. They could see that the crowd was getting more upset by the minute, and they needed to remove Patricia from the situation before things escalated further. But even as they prepared to intervene, more phones appeared throughout the crowd. It seemed like everyone wanted to capture what was happening, either for their own memories or to share with friends and family back home. "I've never seen anything like this at one of these ceremonies," said a tour guide who had been bringing groups to see the changing of the guard for over 10 years. "People usually have so much respect for the traditions here. This is completely unprecedented." Patricia's daughter Kelly was becoming more desperate by the minute. She could see the security guards approaching, and she knew that her mother was about to be in serious trouble. She made one last attempt to defuse the situation. "Please, everyone, she didn't mean it," Kelly said loudly, addressing the crowd. "She's just frustrated and tired from traveling. She's not usually like this. We're really sorry for what happened." But the crowd was not in a forgiving mood. Too many people had witnessed the assault, and too many of them had personal connections to the military or deep respect for British traditions. "Being tired is no excuse for assaulting a soldier," responded the elderly veteran firmly, but not unkindly. He could see that Kelly was genuinely embarrassed and upset by her mother's behavior. A family from Australia, who had been taking photos nearby, decided they needed to speak up as well. "We've traveled halfway around the world to see this ceremony," the father said. "It's supposed to be a respectful, dignified event. What your mother did has ruined it for everyone here." Patricia could feel the walls closing in around her. She had never been in a situation where so many people were openly criticizing her behavior. The anger and disappointment in their voices was overwhelming, and she was starting to realize that maybe she had made a serious mistake. But it was too late to take back what she had done. The security guards were now just a few steps away, and phones were still recording everything that was happening. In a matter of minutes, Patricia had gone from being an anonymous tourist to being the center of an international incident that would soon be viewed by millions of people around the world. The crowd continued to watch and wait, wondering what would happen next in this unprecedented situation at one of Britain's most sacred military traditions. The security response was faster and more coordinated than anyone in the crowd could have imagined. Within seconds of Patricia striking Private Johnson, plainclothes security officers seemed to materialize from nowhere, moving through the crowd with practiced efficiency and calm professionalism. The first officer to reach Patricia was a tall, serious-looking man in his 40s named Officer Williams. He had been watching the situation develop from his position near the castle entrance, and the moment he saw the assault occur, he had radioed for backup and begun moving toward the incident. "Ma'am, please step away from the guard immediately," Officer Williams said in a firm but controlled voice. His tone was polite but left no room for argument or negotiation. Patricia turned toward him with a mix of relief and defiance. She was relieved that someone in authority was finally paying attention to her situation, but she was still convinced that she was the victim of poor treatment. "Thank goodness," she said dramatically. "Finally, someone who can help me deal with this situation. This guard has been completely ignoring me and refusing to cooperate with a simple request for a photo. I've been trying to get his attention for 10 minutes, and he's been incredibly rude." Officer Williams looked at Patricia with the expression that was both professional and slightly incredulous. In his 15 years of security work at various royal properties, he had dealt with thousands of difficult tourists, but he had never encountered anyone who had actually physically assaulted one of the guards. "Ma'am, I need you to understand that what just occurred is not a customer service issue," he explained patiently. "You have just committed a serious criminal offense by striking a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces while he was performing his duties." Patricia's face showed confusion and the beginning of real concern. "Criminal offense? What are you talking about? I barely touched him. He's fine. Look at him. He's not even hurt." But Officer Williams was already speaking into his radio, using codes and terminology that Patricia didn't understand but that sounded very official and serious. "Control, this is Williams at North Gate. We have a confirmed assault on Guard Post 3. Subject is a female American tourist, approximately 50 years old. Request immediate backup and police response." The response crackled back through his radio almost immediately. "Copy that, Williams. Backup is en route. Police have been notified. Maintain control of the situation and prepare for arrest procedures." Kelly felt her heart sink as she heard these radio exchanges. The word arrest made everything suddenly real in a way that it hadn't been before. This wasn't just her mother being difficult with a hotel manager or restaurant server. This was actually serious legal trouble. "Arrest?" Kelly said quietly to Officer Williams. "Is that really necessary?" She's never done anything like this before. "We're just tourists. We didn't know." But Officer Williams was already being joined by 2 more security officers who had approached from different directions. One was a female officer who immediately began documenting the scene with her camera, taking photos of the location where the incident had occurred, and getting witness information from nearby tourists. The third officer, a younger man with military bearing, positioned himself near Private Johnson to ensure that no other tourists would interfere with the guard or the investigation. The ceremony had been quietly suspended, though Private Johnson continued to maintain his position with the same discipline he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. Patricia was beginning to realize that this situation was not going to be resolved with a simple explanation or apology. The security officers were treating her like someone who had committed a serious crime, not like a frustrated customer who had gotten a little carried away. "I want to speak to your supervisor," she demanded. falling back on a tactic that had worked for her in countless other situations. There's been a serious misunderstanding here, and I think someone in charge needs to hear my side of the story. Officer Williams nodded calmly. You'll have plenty of opportunity to explain your actions, ma'am. But first, I need you to understand your current legal situation. You are being detained for assault on a member of the armed forces, which is a serious criminal offense under British law. As he spoke, Patricia noticed that the crowd around them had not dispersed. In fact, more people seemed to be gathering to watch what was happening. Some were still recording with their phones, capturing her interaction with the security officers. Others were speaking to the female officer, apparently volunteering to serve as witnesses to what they had seen. I saw the whole thing, one tourist was saying to the female officer. She was getting more and more aggressive with the guard, and then she hit him with her purse. It was completely unprovoked. She also touched his rifle, added another witness. She tried to move it out of the way before she hit him. Patricia could hear these conversations, and she was starting to understand that the witnesses were not going to support her version of events. Everyone who had seen what happened was describing her as the aggressor, not as a frustrated customer who had been treated poorly. Kelly tried to step in and help her mother's situation. Officers, I'm her daughter. I was here the whole time. My mother was just trying to take a photo. She got frustrated when the guard wouldn't respond to her, but she didn't mean to hurt anyone. She's not a violent person. The female officer looked at Kelly with sympathy but continued taking notes. I understand this is difficult for you, but we have to follow proper procedures when someone assaults a member of the armed forces. This isn't something we can just overlook or handle informally. Meanwhile, Officer Williams was continuing to explain Patricia's situation to her. Ma'am, you're going to be transported to Windsor Police Station for processing. You'll be formally charged and given the opportunity to contact a lawyer. I strongly recommend that you cooperate fully with the investigation. Police station? Patricia's voice was getting higher and more panicked. This is insane. I'm an American citizen. I have rights. You can't just arrest me for something so minor. But even as she protested, Patricia could see that the security officers were not going to change their minds. They were treating this as a serious criminal matter, and nothing she said was going to convince them otherwise. Officer Williams began the formal arrest procedure, speaking in the clear, official language that he had used hundreds of times before. Patricia Henderson, you are under arrest for assault on a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. Patricia stared at him in shock. The formal words of arrest made everything suddenly real in a way that nothing else had. She was actually being arrested in a foreign country in front of hundreds of tourists with cameras. Kelly was crying now, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. Mom, why did you do this? Why couldn't you just listen to me and walk away? But Patricia didn't have an answer for her daughter. She was still trying to process how a simple request for a photo had turned into a criminal arrest. In her mind, she had done nothing wrong. She had been ignored and disrespected, and she had reacted the way any reasonable person would. The security officers began to escort Patricia away from the ceremony area toward a waiting police vehicle. As they walked, more tourists continued to take photos and videos of her arrest. Some were already posting the footage on social media, where it would soon reach audiences around the world. Private Johnson remained at his post throughout the entire arrest process, never once looking at Patricia or acknowledging what had happened to him. His professionalism and discipline in the face of such an unusual situation had earned him the respect and admiration of everyone who witnessed the incident. As Patricia was led away, she could hear the crowd beginning to discuss what they had just seen. The conversations were not sympathetic to her situation. Can you believe someone would do that to one of the guards? Asked one voice. That poor soldier handled it perfectly, said another. I hope they throw the book at her. Patricia's perfect tourist day had become the worst day of her life, and it was only going to get worse from here. The ride to Windsor Police Station was the longest 20 minutes of Patricia's life. Sitting in the back of the police vehicle with her hands secured behind her, she kept expecting someone to realize that a terrible mistake had been made. Surely when they got to the station, a supervisor would listen to her explanation and understand that this was all just a misunderstanding. Kelly followed behind in a taxi, crying quietly as she tried to process what had just happened to her mother. She had already called her father back in Connecticut, waking him up at 5 in the morning to explain that his wife had been arrested in England for assaulting a British soldier. The conversation had not gone well. Patricia's husband, Robert, was a successful businessman who understood the serious implications of what Kelly was describing. He immediately began making phone calls to find the best criminal defense attorney in London, knowing that his wife was going to need expert legal help. At the police station, Patricia was taken through the standard booking procedures. Her fingerprints were taken. Her photograph was captured from multiple angles, and all of her personal belongings were cataloged and secured. The desk sergeant who processed her paperwork was polite but professional, treating her exactly like any other person who had been arrested for a serious crime. "Mrs. Henderson," the desk sergeant explained, "you're being charged with 3 separate offenses under British law. The primary charge is assault on a member of the armed forces, which carries a potential sentence of up to 6 months in prison. You're also being charged with disturbing the peace and interfering with military personnel in the performance of their duties." Patricia listened to these charges with growing horror. 6 months in prison? This was nothing like the minor inconvenience she had expected when she was first arrested. She had thought she might have to pay a small fine or maybe spend a few hours at the police station explaining her side of the story. "This is completely ridiculous," she told the desk sergeant. "I barely touched that guard. He wasn't hurt at all. How can you charge someone with assault when no one was actually injured?" The desk sergeant had heard similar arguments from countless defendants over his 20-year career. "Ma'am, under British law, assault doesn't require physical injury. The fact that you deliberately struck a member of the armed forces while he was performing his official duties is sufficient for the charge. The severity of the penalties reflects the serious nature of attacking military personnel." Patricia was then taken to a holding cell to wait for her lawyer to arrive. The cell was clean but basic, with concrete walls, a simple bench, and a small window that looked out onto the police station parking lot. She had never been in jail before, and the reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. While Patricia waited, the desk sergeant continued processing her case. The incident at Windsor Castle had been captured on multiple security cameras, and the footage clearly showed everything that had happened. There were also dozens of witness statements from tourists who had seen the assault, and several of them had provided their own video recordings of the incident. By the time Patricia's lawyer arrived 3 hours later, the evidence against her was overwhelming. James Worthington was one of London's most respected criminal defense attorneys, and he had handled cases involving tourists who had gotten into legal trouble before. But as he reviewed the evidence against Patricia, his expression grew increasingly grim. "Mrs. Henderson," he said during their first meeting in a private consultation room at the police station, "I need you to understand the seriousness of your situation. The evidence against you is extensive and clear. Multiple cameras captured the entire incident, and there are dozens of witnesses who saw you assault the guard." Patricia was still trying to minimize what had happened. "Mr. Worthington, I think you're making this sound worse than it is. I was just trying to get the guard's attention so I could take a photo. When he ignored me, I got frustrated and tapped him with my purse. It was barely a tap. I didn't hurt him." James Worthington had been practicing criminal law for over 20 years, and he could recognize when a client was in denial about the severity of their actions. He pulled out his tablet and showed Patricia some of the video footage that had already been posted on social media. "Mrs. Henderson, this is not a tap. This is clearly a deliberate strike with a heavy object. The sound of the impact is audible on the recordings. Furthermore, you also touched the guard's rifle, which is considered interfering with military equipment. In Britain, we take attacks on our armed forces very seriously." Patricia watched the videos with growing shock. Seeing herself from the perspective of the witnesses made her actions look much worse than they had felt at the time. The woman in the videos looked angry, aggressive, and completely out of control. She barely recognized herself. "The prosecutor is going to argue that this was a premeditated assault," James continued. "They have video evidence showing you becoming increasingly agitated with the guard over several minutes before you struck him. They'll say you had time to consider your actions and chose to commit violence anyway." The lawyer then explained the potential consequences Patricia was facing. In addition to the possible jail time, she could be fined thousands of pounds, banned from entering the United Kingdom in the future, and required to pay compensation to the guard she'd assaulted. "There's also the matter of your visa status," James added. A criminal conviction could affect your ability to travel to other countries in the future. Many nations share criminal history information, and some may deny entry to people with assault convictions. Patricia felt like the walls were closing in around her. What had started as a simple request for a photo had snowballed into a nightmare that could affect the rest of her life. She thought about her friends back home, her position in the community, her husband's business reputation, and how this scandal might impact all of it. "What are my options?" she asked weakly. James reviewed his notes before responding. "Given the strength of the evidence against you, I would recommend pleading guilty to the assault charge in exchange for the prosecution dropping the other charges. We might be able to argue for a suspended sentence and a fine instead of actual jail time, especially since you have no prior criminal record." "Plead guilty?" Patricia was horrified. "But that means admitting I did something wrong. I was just trying to take a photo." "Mrs. Henderson, you did do something wrong. You assaulted a British soldier while he was performing his duties. The evidence is clear, and fighting the charges would likely result in a harsher sentence if you're convicted at trial." The lawyer then showed Patricia some of the social media posts that had already begun spreading around the internet. The videos of her assault on the guard had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times in just a few hours, and the comments were universally critical of her behavior. "The case has already gained significant public attention," James explained. "If we go to trial, it will likely become an even bigger news story. The judge and jury will be aware of the public interest in the case, which could work against you." Patricia read some of the social media comments about her actions, and they were brutal. People were calling her entitled, disrespectful, and worse. Some were demanding that she face the maximum penalty allowed by law. Others were praising the guard for his restraint and professionalism. "This is ruining my life," Patricia said quietly, finally beginning to understand the full scope of what she had done. James nodded sympathetically. "I understand this is difficult, but we need to focus on minimizing the damage at this point. The best outcome we can hope for is a guilty plea that results in a fine community service and a ban from royal properties. If we're very lucky, we might avoid jail time entirely." Patricia looked around the consultation room, with its institutional furniture and fluorescent lighting, and realized that her life had changed completely in the span of just a few hours. The perfect vacation photo she had wanted so badly was going to cost her more than she could have ever imagined. Outside the police station, news vans were already beginning to gather as word of the incident spread through British media. The story of an entitled American tourist assaulting a Queen's Guard was exactly the kind of scandal that the press loved to cover. Patricia's nightmare was just beginning. While Patricia sat in her holding cell at Windsor Police Station, something unprecedented was happening on the internet. The videos of her assault on Private Johnson were spreading across social media platforms faster than anyone could have predicted, turning her into one of the most infamous tourists in recent history. It started with the tourists who had been at Windsor Castle. Within minutes of Patricia's arrest, dozens of people were uploading their recordings to Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok. Each video showed the incident from a slightly different angle, but they all captured the same shocking moment when Patricia struck the guard with her handbag. The first video to go viral was posted by a college student from Ireland who had been visiting London with her friends. She uploaded the footage to TikTok with the caption, "American tourist loses her mind and attacks British guard. This is insane." Within 2 hours, the video had been viewed over 500,000 times. The hashtag #EnTitledTourist began trending almost immediately. Social media users around the world were sharing the videos and expressing their outrage at Patricia's behavior. The comments were overwhelmingly critical, with people from many different countries condemning her actions. "This is exactly why Americans have a bad reputation as tourists," wrote one user from France. "That guard showed incredible restraint. I would not have been able to stay so calm," commented someone from Australia. "Imagine being so entitled that you think you can assault a soldier because he won't pose for your selfie," posted a user from Canada. By evening, the story had been picked up by major news outlets around the world. The BBC ran the story as their lead international news item, with the headline, "American Tourist Arrested for Assaulting Queen's Guard at Windsor Castle." CNN featured it prominently on their website, calling it a shocking display of tourist entitlement gone wrong. The tabloid newspapers were having a field day with the story. The Daily Mail published a detailed article with frame-by-frame analysis of the assault, along with photos of Patricia being arrested. The Sun ran the story on their front page with the headline, "Handbag Horror, Yank Tourist Attacks Our Hero Guard." Television news programs around the world began featuring the story in their broadcasts. In America, the major networks all covered the incident, often with commentary about American tourists abroad and cultural sensitivity. The videos were played repeatedly, showing Patricia's aggressive behavior and the guard's professional response. Back in Connecticut, Patricia's life was being turned upside down even though she was thousands of miles away. Her husband, Robert, was fielding phone calls from reporters, neighbors, and business associates who had seen the news coverage. The investment firm where he worked was already considering how to distance themselves from the scandal. Patricia's country club had received dozens of calls from members expressing their outrage about her behavior. The club's board of directors held an emergency meeting and unanimously voted to suspend her membership pending a full review of the incident. The social media investigation into Patricia's identity had been swift and thorough. Internet users had identified her full name, her hometown, her husband's business, and even her address within hours of the incident. Photos from her personal social media accounts were being shared and mocked online. People were particularly critical of Patricia's previous social media posts, which showed a lifestyle of luxury and privilege. Images of her expensive vacations, designer clothes, and exclusive events were being used to illustrate the entitled attitude that had led to the assault. "Look at this woman's lifestyle," one viral tweet read, accompanied by photos from Patricia's Instagram account. "She's clearly used to getting whatever she wants whenever she wants it. No wonder she thought she could push around a British soldier." The contrast between Patricia's privileged lifestyle and Private Johnson's military service was a particularly popular topic on social media. Users were sharing information about the guard's background, including his service in Afghanistan and his exemplary military record. This hero served multiple tours in Afghanistan, risking his life for his country, read one widely shared Facebook post. Meanwhile, this entitled tourist thinks she can assault him because he won't move for her vacation photo. Absolutely disgusting. The international nature of the incident was also generating significant discussion about cultural differences and tourist behavior. Many British users were expressing their anger at what they saw as disrespect for their military traditions and national symbols. "The Queen's Guard represents centuries of British military tradition," wrote one popular British blogger. "These are real soldiers who have served in combat zones around the world. For a tourist to assault one of them shows a complete lack of respect for our culture and history." American social media users were largely embarrassed by Patricia's behavior and were quick to distance themselves from her actions. Many were apologizing on behalf of their country and expressing support for the British Guard. "As an American, I am absolutely mortified by this woman's behavior," read one typical comment. "She does not represent us. We respect the military and understand the importance of following rules when visiting other countries." The tourism industry was also weighing in on the incident. Travel bloggers and guidebook writers were using Patricia's case as an example of how not to behave when visiting foreign countries. Several tourism organizations issued statements reminding travelers about the importance of respecting local customs and following rules at historical sites. Meanwhile, Patricia remained largely unaware of the global firestorm that was developing around her case. In her holding cell, she had no access to social media or news coverage. She had no idea that millions of people around the world were watching videos of her assault and condemning her behavior. Kelly was trying to manage the situation from her hotel room, but she was overwhelmed by the scale of the coverage. Reporters were calling her constantly, trying to get comments about her mother's behavior. The hotel staff had to help her avoid the photographers who were gathering in the lobby. The story was also generating significant discussion about mental health and anger management. Some commentators were suggesting that Patricia's behavior indicated underlying psychological issues that needed to be addressed. "Normal people don't react this way to minor frustrations," wrote one psychology professor in an op-ed for a major newspaper. "This incident suggests someone who has serious problems with impulse control and anger management." Private Johnson, meanwhile, was being hailed as a hero for his restraint and professionalism. The British Army issued a statement praising his conduct and noting that he had handled an unprecedented situation with exemplary discipline. Private Johnson's behavior under extreme provocation exemplifies the highest standards of the British Army, the statement read. His restraint and professionalism in the face of an unprovoked assault demonstrates the quality of our soldiers and their commitment to duty. Gifts and messages of support were pouring in for Private Johnson from around the world. People were sending letters, flowers, and donations to military charities in his honor. A crowdfunding campaign to show appreciation for his service raised over £50,000 in just 24 hours. The incident was also generating serious discussion about security at royal properties. Some experts were questioning whether the guards needed better protection from aggressive tourists, while others argued that changing the traditions would give in to unacceptable behavior. By the end of the first day, the story had been covered by news outlets in over 40 countries. Patricia had become internationally famous, but for all the wrong reasons. Her few seconds of anger had turned her into a symbol of entitled tourist behavior and disrespect for military service. The worst part was that the coverage showed no signs of slowing down. If anything, the story was gaining momentum as more people discovered the videos and shared their outrage. Patricia's humiliation was being broadcast to a global audience, and there was no way to take it back. The perfect vacation photo she had wanted so badly had turned into the most embarrassing moment of her life, viewed by millions of people around the world. 6 months after the incident at Windsor Castle, Patricia stood before Magistrate Harrison in a crowded courtroom that had drawn international media attention. The once confident woman who had demanded special treatment from a British guard now appeared small and defeated, wearing a simple black dress instead of her usual designer outfits. The courtroom was packed with reporters from around the world, all there to cover the sentencing of the woman who had become known globally as the entitled tourist. Camera crews waited outside, ready to capture Patricia's reaction to whatever punishment the judge would impose. Magistrate Harrison had reviewed all the evidence carefully over the past months. The videos of Patricia's assault on Private Johnson had been viewed millions of times, and the case had generated unprecedented discussion about tourist behavior and respect for military personnel. Mrs. Henderson, the magistrate began, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of British legal tradition. You have pleaded guilty to assaulting a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces while he was performing his duties. This court must consider not only the nature of your actions, but also their impact on public order and respect for our military institutions. Patricia's lawyer had negotiated the best deal possible under the circumstances, but even the reduced charges carried serious consequences. The prosecution had agreed to drop the interference with military equipment charge in exchange for Patricia's guilty plea to assault. The court sentences you to a fine of £5,000 to be paid within 30 days, Magistrate Harrison continued. You are also sentenced to 200 hours of community service to be completed in programs supporting military veterans. Finally, you are banned for life from all royal properties and official ceremonies throughout the United Kingdom. Patricia felt relief that she wasn't going to prison, but the lifetime ban hit her harder than she had expected. The thought that she could never visit any of Britain's royal sites again made the consequences of her moment of anger feel permanent and irreversible. The financial cost was actually much higher than just the £5,000 fine. Patricia had spent over $200,000 on legal fees, travel expenses for multiple court appearances, and private security to protect her from the constant media attention. Her husband, Robert's investment firm, had quietly asked him to take early retirement after the scandal became too much of a distraction for their wealthy clients. Several major accounts had been lost when clients didn't want to be associated with the firm that employed the husband of the guard attacker. The social consequences had been even more devastating than the legal ones. Patricia's entire social circle had evaporated almost overnight. Invitations to charity events, dinner parties, and cultural activities had simply stopped coming. Former friends would cross the street to avoid talking to her when they saw her in town. Her country club membership had been permanently revoked, despite her family's 20-year history with the organization. The board had voted unanimously that her behavior was incompatible with the club's values and reputation. Even her relationship with her daughter Kelly had been severely damaged. Kelly had been so embarrassed by the global coverage of her mother's behavior that she had temporarily moved to a different state to escape the attention. Their weekly phone calls had become monthly conversations, and Kelly still couldn't discuss the incident without becoming upset. The internet had never forgotten Patricia's moment of infamy. The videos of her assault on Private Johnson continued to circulate on social media, often being reshared whenever discussions about entitled tourist behavior arose. Her name had become synonymous with the worst kind of American tourist stereotype. A year after the incident, Patricia had completed her community service hours at a local veterans center. Ironically, working with former military personnel had given her a much better understanding of the significance of what she had done. Hearing stories from veterans about their service and sacrifices had finally made her realize how serious her assault on Private Johnson had been. "I spent months serving meals and organizing activities for these brave men and women," Patricia said in a rare interview with a local Connecticut newspaper. "Listening to their stories made me understand that what I did wasn't just hitting someone. It was attacking everything they had fought to protect." Veterans she worked with had been surprisingly forgiving once they got to know her personally. Many of them appreciated that she seemed genuinely remorseful and was putting in real effort to make amends for her actions. Private Johnson, meanwhile, had become something of a celebrity in his own right. The video of his professional restraint while being assaulted had made him a symbol of military discipline and dedication to duty. He had been promoted and received several commendations for his exemplary conduct during the incident. The British Army had used Johnson's story as a recruiting tool, highlighting how their soldiers maintain their composure and professionalism, even in the most challenging circumstances. Johnson himself had given several interviews where he spoke about the importance of military service and the honor of protecting British traditions. "I was just doing my job," Johnson had said in one television interview. "Every guard knows that we might face difficult situations with the public. Our training prepares us to stay focused on our duty regardless of distractions or provocations." The incident had led to some changes in security procedures at royal properties. While the traditional ceremonies continued unchanged, additional plainclothes security officers were now positioned throughout crowds at major events to intervene more quickly if tourists became aggressive tourism. Officials had also used Patricia's case to create educational materials about appropriate behavior at historical sites. Videos and brochures now specifically mention the importance of respecting military personnel and following rules at ceremonial events. The case had become a teaching tool in hospitality and tourism programs around the world. Students studying international travel and cultural sensitivity were shown the videos of Patricia's behavior as an example of how cultural misunderstandings and entitled attitudes could lead to serious legal consequences. For Patricia personally, the incident had forced a complete reevaluation of her life and values. The woman who had once demanded special treatment wherever she went now understood how her privileged lifestyle had made her blind to the feelings and experiences of others. "I spent my whole life thinking that because I had money and status, I deserved to get my way," Patricia reflected during her community service. "It took this horrible experience to make me realize that other people have feelings, dignity, and rights that I was completely ignoring." The therapy sessions that Patricia had started after the incident had helped her understand the underlying attitudes that had led to her assault on the guard. She had grown up in a family where wealth and status were used to solve problems and get special treatment, and she had never learned to handle situations where those advantages didn't work. Patricia's marriage had survived the scandal, but it had been fundamentally changed. Robert had initially been angry and embarrassed by his wife's behavior, but he had eventually come to understand that she needed help rather than just criticism. "We both had to learn that money and success don't make you better than other people," Robert said in a joint interview with his wife. "This experience has been humbling for our entire family, but it's also made us more aware of how fortunate we are and how we should treat others." The incident had also had lasting effects on tourism at Windsor Castle. While visitor numbers had initially increased due to curiosity about the assault location, many tourists now approached the guards with much more respect and understanding about their role and the seriousness of their duties. 3 years after the incident, Patricia was living a much quieter life. She had moved to a smaller house and become involved in local charity work. particularly with organizations that supported military families. The global infamy had never completely faded, but she had learned to live with the consequences of her actions. The videos of her assault on Private Johnson still appeared occasionally on social media, usually accompanied by discussions about privilege, respect, and personal responsibility. But Patricia had stopped reading the comments and had learned to focus on the positive changes she had made in her life since that terrible day. "I can't change what I did," Patricia said in a recent interview marking the anniversary of the incident, "but I can spend the rest of my life trying to be the kind of person who would never do something like that again. The guard I attacked served his country with honor, and I dishonored myself and my own country with my behavior. The least I can do is learn from it and try to help others avoid making the same mistakes." Private Johnson continued his military service with distinction, eventually being assigned to train other guards in crowd management and dealing with difficult civilians. His handling of Patricia's assault had become a legendary example within the regiment of how to maintain military bearing under extreme provocation. The lasting impact of those few seconds of violence at Windsor Castle continued to ripple outward, affecting not just Patricia and her family, but also changing conversations about tourist behavior, cultural respect,